DDD conferences hold a special place in my heart. I always love the atmosphere and the audiences and getting to come and speak and share what I'm passionate about with everybody. I want to quickly have a bit of a shout out to some of the amazing sponsors, well not some, of all of the amazing sponsors that we have here today. For anyone that's not familiar or didn't listen to, I'm assuming, the shout out that happened this morning, DDDs literally could not happen if not for sponsors. Like, your ticket will not cover the food that you eat today. So if you don't think you're getting your money's worth, you just have another cup of coffee or eat some more food. Like, it's not hard. I also want to quickly acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I got that wrong, didn't I? Wurundjeri? Wurundjeri. It's really exciting, as I said, to be here today. So I have come all the way from the Noongar Nation in Western Australia. And this morning, I'm here to talk to you about JavaScript, specifically when you don't need JavaScript and why you don't always have to use JavaScript for things. And I want to start off because a lot of the JavaScript developers in the audience, I'm assuming there's a bunch of you here to heckle me and tell me I'm wrong. I want to start off by placating you and tell you that JavaScript is in fact useful. I understand that JavaScript is useful, but the problem is it's often overused. And I want to talk about some of the situations where you may not necessarily need to use JavaScript as much as we currently do. The thing is, HTML and CSS are much lighter alternatives to use. They don't take as long to load, they don't require as many third-party resources, and most of the times they have native browser support. We're not having to bundle and build stuff together. So today we're going to build a web app, or app, site kind of thing, and it's going to have no JavaScript whatsoever. That means we're also going to use no build tools, no NPM packages, just static HTML, CSS, and a couple of images. So I'm going to start off with a couple of tricks that we can use HTML for. First, we're going to look at content targeting, and second, we're going to look at accordions, which are one of the developers' favorite things to build. So content targeting. For anybody that's not familiar, we can use the link tag, that's the A tag, not the button tag, the A tag, to target other content. So a lot of the time that's another page or another website. It could be another file or resource like an image or a PDF or something we're downloading. But one of the other things we can do is we can use the A tag to reference an ID of an element on the same page or another page, and we can send the user straight to that section, to that element. There's then a CSS selector, which is the target selector, and this allows us to determine if this element has been targeted with its ID as a hash value. And what we can do with that is here we have, if I can find my mouse, here we have a beautiful page with a whole lot of content on there, which isn't super great. And what I can do is, so each of these sections is inside of a section element, and I want to hide all of them. And then I want to say if the section is the target, so if I'm targeting its ID in the URL, I want to display it again. If I press save, then manually refresh, because I'm not using a build tool. So I now just have a single page. And if I click through, I can navigate to other pages and hide and show the different sections without having to reload an entire page. Effectively, I've created a single page application without JavaScript. And now I've lost my mouse again. Now, browser support. Everyone loves browser support. Target, unsurprisingly, is the target pseudo selector is actually pretty good. It's been around for quite a while, even works in IE. So this one totally works. However, full disclosure, probably first of all, full disclosure is, this isn't 100% serious talk. A lot of what I'm going to go through is definitely something that you can do, not necessarily something that you should do. So we're going to have a little bit of chat about what you should and shouldn't do and why and the alternatives. So full disclosure, this method involves messing with the URL hash values. Not a great alternative most of the time, and it's not great for accessibility, so not necessarily something you're going to want to do a lot. You can, doesn't mean you should. Next we have accordions. Now, accordions super easy because there's literally a HTML element for it. These are the details and summary elements. The details element is the overall container that wraps the whole section. The summary is the little clickable bit that we can then, we will always see that, and then it just expands and contracts. We can put any other content that we like inside there. Could be paragraphs, could be images, could be something else. You can probably put another details element inside it if you want to. I don't know, it'd be weird. Not great for users, but would work. Now, if I have a look, I have a FAQ section. Yeah, I have collapsible sections. Just like an accordion, no JavaScript whatsoever. I also didn't even have to use CSS. That is all 100% browser-supported HTML. Now, browser support, oddly enough, Internet Explorer, but you know, if you're supporting Internet Explorer, I'm just very sorry for you. For the rest of them, this has been around for a while, and the advantage is if this doesn't have good browser support, if the browser doesn't support it, it will just display the entire sections as open. So it's not like the content's going to be hidden for people if their browser doesn't support it. No full disclosure here, this is actually a really good alternative. If you have collapsible sections, highly recommend using them. And as I said, when they're not supported, they'll just display as open. Next, we have a couple of tricks with CSS. We're going to have a look at nesting, sliders, testimonials, switches, and one of our favorite things to build, image carousels. First up, nesting. So one of the things that we often use build tools, specifically CSS pre-processors or post-processors or frameworks or libraries or something else, is nesting, because it is so much easier for us to go through and nest elements inside of one another rather than having to go through and write the full selector out. Now, depending on what language you've used, it could have an ampersand, or I think some of them use other symbols, or it might just natively select without having to use anything else. Now, the great thing about this is we don't need a build tool for that anymore. CSS nesting is officially supported in browsers as of last year, which is really exciting because it means we can start to do this natively without having to use a build tool. Now, I've spoken to a whole lot of developers, and like 90% of the reason why they use preprocessors is for nesting. The fact that we can do this just in the browser now is pretty awesome. So that's getting rid of one JavaScript tool as part of our pipeline. Next, we want to have a look at range sliders. Now, range sliders, I'm talking about the input type of range, which allows us to define a minimum and a maximum value. Range sliders, we can also then define labels for them. We use this using the data list element, and we can pass in the data list has an ID, in this case options. We can then pass that list ID to the range input, and this allows us to define labels associated with the range. So rather than asking people, what would you rate this talk on a scale from 0 to 10, it's like, well, what are you expecting? Like, is 10, this changed my life, or is it I learnt something? So we're able to go through and assign labels to how we're able to go through and assign labels to how we assign the different values. Now, this is really useful for things like, anybody here familiar with NPS surveys? I'm sorry, I hate dealing with NPS surveys. For anybody that's not familiar with them, NPS surveys are commonly used to determine customer satisfaction. You remember when we called Telstra and then they send an email to go, how much would you recommend your experience today? That kind of thing. The thing is, it's generally rated from 0 to 10. Anything less than a 7 is negative. Now, how many people are generally... Okay, I'm not going to use Telstra as an example. Generally, when we get these reviews, how often are we just kind of ambivalent about it? We're not upset with the experience, but we're not really happy about it. Who here would give them a 5? Yeah, it's mid-ground. We're not happy, but we're not mad about it, so we give them a 5. But according to these companies, 5 is negative, 7 is middle ground. So being able to assign labels to the values mean that we can convey what we're expecting people to give back from the data we're getting. Now, if we have a look, lost my mouse again. If we have a look here, have a contact form, which has a range slider here. Now I can go through and have a look. Now, I'm going to make this a little bit bigger because this is... So, I'm going to talk through the CSS because this is fun. It's even more fun when I try and write it live. So, we're going to take advantage of a few special things. First off is the has selector. So, the has selector, for anybody that hasn't heard of it, is as close as we're going to get to a parent selector in CSS. A has selector allows us to check inside of an element without actually descending in. So, we're checking the form element has an input of type range, and that input of type range has a immediate next sibling of data list, and that data list has an option, and that option is the first child. Now, inside of this first query, I'm then going to assign the CSS variable options 1. What I'm able to do with these queries, so the next one is mostly the same except for I'm checking for the data list option of type 2, and then I'm checking for the data list option of number 3. So what that's actually doing is I'm able to count how many options exist in my data list and then assign a value to a CSS variable that's accessible at the form level. So I'm able to count how many children exist and use that in the parent. Now, this is probably where I would use a JavaScript tool to kind of automate this rather than writing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 queries. Probably want to go through and automate that. So I now have a CSS variable where I know how many options are inside of it. I then want to go through and I want to set the size of my range to be 100%, but with a bit of a gap on the side. I'm doing some fun CSS maths in here because I have half of an engineering degree, and so I want to actually use that maths for something, and therefore my CSS generally looks complicated. I'm then checking, so if the range input, then I want to get the data list that's directly next to it. What this means is that if I have multiple range inputs, it's only going to get the next data list, not all of the data lists in the form. And I'm going to use display grid on the data list, and I want to set the grid template columns So the number of columns should be equal to the number of options with one 50 pixel wide column at the start. But then, actually, no, I've said that incorrectly. I should have one fixed 50 pixel column at the beginning, and then there should be repeated the number of times that I have options, 1FR, 2M. What this does is this will create one column, two columns for each option, and I can then go through and alternate to lay out the labels. I then want to set each of these to span across 3 columns, and I'm going to set the start based on the number, and then every second one I want to set it to the grid row below. So I'm able to go through an offset. For anyone that is really confused because it's very early in the morning and trying to get their head around this, I will share the code at the end so you can sit there and just go, what is she going on about? So what this means is we can have some beautiful labels that will appear below our range slider, and people can see what it is they're actually saying. So in this question, how much do you know about JavaScript? It's like, well, I don't know. Am I 5? Am I 10? How much do I know about JavaScript? I can go, well, I've used it more than once or twice. I can follow a tutorial. I'm fine as long as it works most of the time, use it fairly regularly, or use JavaScript for everything. So we're able to go through and assign some more user-friendly values to the range input. Now, input of type range has also been around for quite a while, so the browser support for this is pretty good. A lot of the time we can just go through and use this. There's probably a whole lot of third-party packages that we can stop using as well, because we can use the native element. The data list is mostly supported. It is in Firefox now, just a little bit new. But for the other browsers, it has been around for a while, so we've got pretty good support for that one. The has selector, actually, someone may be able to correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure the has selector has, like, in the last week or so, it may have just finally come to Firefox, or it might be a nightly. It's coming soon, very, very soon. So unfortunately, the has selector is not something that we can actively use in production at the moment, but that one's going to be really cool when we can. Next, we're going to have a look at some testimonials. Really should have taken the lid off beforehand with a handheld mic. So here, I have a testimonial slider because not only do clients love showing testimonials, they want people to be able to click through to different ones. So here I'm using radio inputs. So I have a radio input, input of type radio. It has an ID, testimonial 1, and the name of testimonials. The label for testimonial 1, which I'm going to hide visually because we're not going to use, but labels are very important for accessibility. So even for fun purposes, I will pretty much never write an input without a label. And afterwards we have a block quote, which is where our testimonial is going to be. Now this is going to then repeat for all of the testimonials that I have. I can once again use the has selector hack that we looked at earlier, where I can go through and check if my container div has a paragraph of nth child 4, children 4. If it has a paragraph of nth child 5, children 5, I can go through and count the number of things inside of it. So in the case of testimonials, I want to go through and count if my testimonials container has a testimonial that has a child of 5, then I know that I have 5 of them. So if I have a look at testimonials, I can see I'm able to go through and count if it has a block quote. In this case, I am counting nth of type because I'm counting for if it's a block quote element specifically, not just a child. I'm able to go through and assign a variable value of num test, as in number of testimonials, to 5, for 5. So this one, I then want to go through. So the testimonials container. I should probably get up the testimonials. The testimonials container, I'm setting to use CSS Grid again. I want 2 rows. The first row will take up most of the container and the last row will be auto height. The number of columns should be the number of testimonials with 2 columns, 2 empty columns on either side. And I want everything inside of it to be justified in the center. I'm then going to go through and I'm going to have a look at the before pseudo selector in a second. I'm then going to go through and I want nicer looking radio inputs. So I'm going to make fake radio inputs. So I'm going to check if an input has a type of radio. I'm going to set that to be display none. I don't want that one to appear on the page. But then I'm going to check if that input is checked. I'm going to style the label. So I have a radio input and then I have a label and then I have a block quote. If the radio input is checked, I want to get the label that's directly next to it. Then I want to get the block quote that's directly next to that. That's the testimonial that is assigned to that radio input. And I want to set the opacity to be 1 because I've hidden all of the other ones. And I want to turn on pointer events again because I've hidden all the other ones. And I'm also then going to set quotes to go around it. So here I've turned off pointer events and set opacity to be 0. And I also want the block quote to take up the entire first row of my grid and then just be the, entire first row of my grid. So first column to last column, but then just take up the first row. Lastly, I'm going to go through, and this is where I'm going to make my beautiful radio inputs. So I'm going to use this using the label. First, I want to go through and visually hide the content of the label. So I'm going to set it to transparent and font size to be tiny. I also want the radio inputs to appear after the block quotes. So I'm going to set the order to be 2, that will put them at the end, and the grid row should be 2, so they should appear in the second row of the grid. I then want to style the pseudo element of the label, so before and after. I want to set that height to be 20 pixels and width to be 20 pixels, and here is where I'm going to create my radio inputs. And here, I'm creating some beautiful little radio inputs that I can style a little bit better than I could do with the native element. I also want to take advantage of, often we could go through and use borders, or we could make one of them slightly bigger, but in this case I want to take advantage of the fact that if the radio input is checked, I want to use a radial gradient. In this case, it's going to be circular. It should be the same green that I'm currently using, and I want it to be 100% of the size, minus 6 pixels. So what that's going to do is that's going to give my radio input to be almost the full size, but with a little bit of a gap on the outside. And this way, we're able to create a circle that's slightly smaller. So a little bit of cool fun with CSS. Lastly, I want to go through and check if the testimonials has an input of type radio. No, if the testimonials doesn't have an input of type radio that is checked, that means none of the radio inputs have been checked. I want to display the first block quote and pretend that that radio input is checked. So right now, this technically isn't checked, but I just want to go through and do that. So I'm able to go through and automatically one of them appears checked. But I can then go through and change all of these, and if I zoom out just a little bit here, so you can see the full thing, this will then go through and remain centered, and I don't end up with any layout shift either, even though these testimonials are all of different sizes. So that's pretty cool. No JavaScript whatsoever. So, browser support has selector, not spectacular. December 2023. There we go. It's been, I was about to say it's been out for a month, but it's been out for 3 now, hasn't it? It's fine. I know what month we're in. It's okay. I'm in Sydney right now, right? I went to Norway. Man, I thought that flight was long. I must have slept longer than I thought. So, browser support for Has does exist in Firefox now as of December last year. So, you know, we can immediately start using it in production because that means it's fully supported now, right? The not selector, which allows us to check if a CSS selector doesn't match, we can also use. That's been around for a while as well. And lastly, CSS Grid, I added for completeness. That has been around for quite a while and does technically have support in Internet Explorer, but if anyone's using it, I highly recommend checking out another talk I've done, which is about CSS Grid, where I talk about the fun parts of Internet Explorer and CSS Grid. Full disclosure on the testimonials slider. In this case, we're kind of messing with using form inputs, which isn't great. We're using form inputs but not using them in a form, and that can also be really confusing for assistive technologies like screen readers. So I would recommend, if you were using this kind of method, you'll need to use some ARIA labels and roles to give more information to assistive technologies about what you're doing. Might be confusing for why people clicking on radio buttons change testimonials. And I did have a disclaimer about the Has selector, but that's all good now. Next, toggle switch. Love building switches. Switches are great. So, switches. There's a lot of very strong opinions about how to build switches, whether or not it should just be whether a checkbox is on or off, or how to do things. I prefer a verbose method of there are 2 radio inputs that show on or off. So I very clearly know whether or not I have on selected or off selected. So here I have a toggle. I have 2 radio inputs. Both of these have the name of switch. One has a value of on, the other one has the value of off. I also have a span, which I'm going to use to style things, and that has a class of switch. Now, I think I do have time to go through how this works. So here, I have a beautiful little toggle which can go back and forwards. Now, to do this, I'm using Flexbox so everyone sits next to one another. I also want the labels to appear at the ends. Once again, I'm going through and hiding the radio inputs, but I want to style the labels associated with the radio inputs. And I'm also adding a pseudo element to each of the labels too. Now, these pseudo elements, I'll share the site at the end afterwards, and I recommend having a look in the inspect element. Actually, I've got time, I can have a look now. So, if I have a look here, so I have my input label. Now, there is a pseudo selector for my on label. So if the switch has a value of off, so if the input with a value of off is checked, I then want to get the input with a value of on and get the label next to it and create a pseudo element on it. This pseudo element I want to overlay over not just the label but the switch as well. If I turn the switch on, this would instead create a pseudo element on the off selector, on the off label, so it gets an input with a value of off and then gets the label next to it and create a pseudo element on that label, what this does is this means that any clicks on a pseudo element are registered as a click on the element itself. So if I have a pseudo element, it would register the click on the label. Because my labels are correctly linked to my inputs, the click on the pseudo element is registered as a click on the radio input. That means that even if I click directly on the switch, it's still registering the click. If not, I would have to click on one of the labels. But this makes sure that wherever I click on the switch, it's still going to change it, even though I'm not clicking directly on the label. Now, next part, now that I've got my functioning switch, I can now use this to add dark mode, because everyone loves having dark mode. Dark mode's the best. I was teaching a boot camp the other week, and everyone's really excited to put dark mode on their personal websites until they discover how hard it is to do dark mode, and they're like, oh no, this was a mistake. So the fun thing is, on our computers and our devices, we're able to select whether or not we prefer dark or light mode. A lot of us have probably already done this, and we can actually take that choice into consideration. So we can go through and check, do a media query for if prefers color scheme dark, I can go through and change the colors that I'm using on the website. So if this person has said they prefer the dark color scheme, I can change the colors I'm using in the styling so that I can respect their choices. So I can go through and do that. But the other thing is I can go through, and assign this. So here I have prefers color scheme light and prefers color scheme dark. But I can also go through and check for whether or not someone has selected a switch. So I have another switch in the footer of my page, which has light and dark mode. And in here, I can go through and check, does the body have a theme toggle, which has an input of type radio, which has a value of light that is checked. I can then go through and change the variables of the colors that I'm using to be variables that will work for light mode. And I can then go through and check, does the body have a theme toggle of type input, a theme toggle which has an input of type radio that has a value of dark that is checked, they've selected dark mode. In which case, I can go through and change my CSS variables to be colors that are better for dark mode. And then, when I use my theme switch at the bottom, I can change between light and dark mode. So that's pretty cool. No JavaScript whatsoever, dark mode works. Now, has selector, same slide as before. Has selector is once again good everything. Ignore the Firefox because that's been good since December. So we can use the has selector. The prefers color scheme media query has also been around for a while as well, so that's pretty good. Browser support. Full disclosure, so similar to using similar for the testimonials, using form inputs outside of forms isn't great for accessibility. So once again, I'd recommend using ARIA labels and roles to signify and convey information about what it is that you're using and what the purpose of the elements are. In this case, also using JavaScript would allow triggering more complex functionality. For example, saving the value so it persists on page reloads. For example, at the moment, no, not next slide. At the moment, I have dark mode, but when I refresh, it clears it. So by using JavaScript, I could assign a value to local storage or something similar so that value would persist. Lastly, Want to look at image carousels? Love working with image carousels. Image carousels are like one of the hills I will die on when clients request them. I just go, no, not doing that. When they ask me why, they're like, because it's a pain to build, it's a pain for users, it's bad for, like, there's literally no wins apart from marketing teams. Marketing teams are the only ones that like image carousels. Now, image carousels. Similar to the testimonials slider, I'm able to go through and use radio inputs, where I have a radio input assigned to each image. I have a radio input and an image repeated for each image in the image carousel. So I have a radio input of name images. I then have a label, because accessibility, even though there's a whole lot of stuff that's not great for accessibility, I just couldn't bring myself to not have a label. And then I have an image which is inside of a container. Now, most of this, I swear I ordered my files so that I wouldn't have to search for the right one, and then for some reason VS Code decided to go through. So, image carousel, similar to the way that testimonials work, and I'm not going to go through all of the code. I'm just going to look at a couple of things. So the difference with this one is in the testimonials we had all of the radio inputs that appear at the bottom. In this case, I only want the next and the previous radio input to appear. So in this case, I'm checking for if the input of type radio is checked, I want to get the label that's next to it, and then I want to get the image that's next to it, and I want to set the opacity to be 1, so I want that one to display. That image, this current image, I then want to get the radio input that's next to that, and I want to get the label that's next to that one, because those are the ones associated with the next image, and I want to display that one and assign that to sit here, because that's my next arrow. And I have the before element, which is the arrow, so that I know it's going that way. So this is the radio input associated with the next image, which when I click on that, it checks the radio input for the next image, and that one appears. I then want to go through, and if, this is where it gets fun. Okay, if an input of type radio is not checked, but if it has a label directly next to it, which has an image directly next to it, which has an input of type radio directly next to it that is checked, that's the previous one. And in which case, I want to set that radio input label to display, and I want to set it to be the grid area of previous, which is going to sit it here, and I want to set the before pseudo selector content to be the previous arrow. I'm also then going to add an image transform, so that radio input that isn't selected but the next one is, I then want to go through and set the transform of the image to translate it, to just like move it to the side. And what that does is that will then give me the cool sliding effect and opacity change. As I click through, I have an animated image carousel that works with no JavaScript whatsoever. That's pretty cool, right? Like, I still hate... I was told this was a nice audience. And then Aaron walked in. So here, I have a functioning animated image carousel with no JavaScript whatsoever. So that is pretty good. I'm pretty sure that's the only image carousel I've ever been excited to build. There'll be questions in a couple of minutes, Aaron, you can wait. Okay, CSS Grid, which we use for that one. Once again, the support for that one's pretty good. Again, you can check out my other talk on CSS Grid if you want to know more about that. The has selector, also there are so many slides for the has selector that I now get to go through and change. The has selector has full support across the real browsers. I'm not talking about IE. So we can go through and use that one now. Full disclosure, carousels still suck. They're not good for accessibility, and once again we're messing with form inputs outside of forms, so ARIA labels, and make sure we're conveying information about what it is we're doing with the elements. Would also recommend turning the animation off and doing a media query for prefers reduced motion, so if anybody has set their device to turn off animations, that we're respecting those choices. But also just don't do this, just use a gallery, it's fine. For anybody that does not believe me, node.js.amyskapers.dev is a live version of this website. You can turn JavaScript off. It will still work. I'll share this link out at the end for anyone that's missed this. You can test it out yourself and confirm that I am in fact telling the truth about JavaScript. I want to finish up though, and just for all of the JavaScript developers that I've annoyed in the audience, JavaScript is useful, but it's not always the answer. So when you get back to your desks on Monday, I want you to have a think about when you go to write JavaScript, can you do it with HTML instead? Can you do it with CSS? And when you're using JavaScript, can it make things better? Are you using JavaScript to make things better? Is there any JavaScript that can be removed? Also, do you really need to track this thing? For all of the tracking scripts that you've got, do you actually need to track something? Are people using the data? I would say ask yourself that question, but probably ask the other people in the team that have requested the scripts that question as well. So I think we have like a minute for questions.
Yes, and especially if they're not from the front row.
Yes.
Stick your hand up. I have a mic. I can walk. Anything. Any Quokka related questions would be good as well.
I just wanted to know what the extension you use in VS Code for CSS.
Which extension I used?
The one that stacks the selectors.
I actually don't know. I had never seen that happen before today, so I'm not entirely sure what VS Code was doing.
So you've said that be cognizant of why we're using so much of JavaScript. That's a valid point. But what do you think are real barriers of using HTML, of not using native HTML and CSS? What do you think?
The values of not using...
the barriers, I would say.
Sorry.
So what are the barriers in not
barriers.
using? Yeah. So
sorry, I haven't had my coffee yet.
What really stops us?
What are the barriers of using native HTML and CSS? A lot of it's the extensibility, but also having to repeat yourself for just using native HTML and CSS. So although I did build this entire thing without JavaScript, it's one HTML file. So often why I end up using JavaScript is so I can split my thing up into different parts and then import them elsewhere. So for me, a lot of the really good uses for JavaScript are actually as part of the build process, not necessarily on the client side. In terms of barriers for using native HTML and CSS on the client side, off the top of my head, I couldn't really think of any of them. A lot of them is around just the really big code bases. JavaScript will generally make things just a little bit easier, especially for a lot of teams working on different things. Being able to do that around the browser support as well. So for some of these newer things, some teams are able to use them, but if you're supporting a lot of people with old browsers, then that's not necessarily something that you're able to do. So those are some of the issues. The other thing as well comes to a little bit around styling. So particularly some of the native HTML Form inputs, the styling that we're able to do are limited, which is when we'll often then use like a JavaScript package with a fully stylable and customizable option. That one's always worth a question with the design team to go, look, do we really need to do it? Like, this is the effort for me to make it look the way you want it, but this is used in one form on one page and 3 people a year fill it out. Can we just use a native one instead?